Alright, hello everybody. No, it's been quite a while since I've been back on this thing. It's been about 10 months actually. But I wanted to go ahead and come in finally for really the first time this year and actually do a video. Just all kinds of stuff. It pops up when you least expect it and then you forget about it and everything. And then you go back, you look over the history of what you have, and then you're thinking, darn, I really need to get back into doing that. So one of these days we'll be able to do this on a much more regular basis, but right now it's still quite sporadic. But yeah, it's hard to believe it's now almost October, and this is actually the first video I've done for this year, so that's pretty bad. But nonetheless, I wanted to go ahead here today and come in as I've been taking some time to actually look at some topics that I felt need to be covered a little bit more, a little bit of a deviation to slightly from stuff that I'm typically trying to cover on this channel. And one of the topics that has really come to light, at least in the past year for me, is an actual particular interest of mine that has really started to come about. And within the last year, since about last September, so it's been about a year, last September, I started to get into the whole interest of Irish history and Irish topic because I was doing ancestry research on my own. And while I had known I had German ancestors and English ancestors, as I was doing this ancestry research, I ended up discovering that I had some Irish heritage as well, which led me into looking a bit of the history of Ireland. And really, I must say that within the past year, I have developed quite the fondness for the Irish culture and the Irish people. I have really been marveled at their history because, I mean, we Americans, we commonly try to portray when we go for the American Revolution that we are victims of British oppression at that time, and we were to some degree. But in large part, in my honest historical opinion, it was mostly because Americans did not want to pay taxes for a war that honestly benefited them more. But then again, let's look today. No American in their right mind likes to pay taxes. It's been a problem since our founding, and it's still an issue now. But basically, when you compare American Revolutionary history with Irish, you realize the Americans had it a lot easier off. Mind you, yes, we fought an 8-year long war with Britain. We had our own grievances with Britain, but also keep in mind we're colonies and we're God knows how many miles away across an entire ocean before the British can even send troops there. The Irish, they have been oppressed by the English for roughly since 1200, yeah, since the year 1200 CE, and a little bit before that. And unlike us with our revolutionary days, the Irish, they couldn't just, bet on the chance that it would take a long time for British reinforcements or actions to come across an ocean because there's only just this small little sea that divides the island of Ireland from the British Isles. So it's next door neighbor. It's no different than Britain going to France. It's just a channel that separates the two. So the Irish had a much more difficult prospect in my mind because they've been oppressed for far longer. The British were actually like right there, so it wouldn't take that long for the British to actually send reinforcements to suppress any kind of rebellion. And that's also where it gets more nasty is the Americans, we got off lightly compared to what the Irish have had. The Irish have put up with English hegemony for a long, long time, and in all honesty, it got bloody, far bloodier than anything the American Revolution could conjure up at times. Now, I'm not saying this was all the British, because at times, the Irish, it was tit for tat. It was Irish would do something, the British would do something in response that was equally atrocious. It was both sides off and on, but more often than not, the English were the ones instigating a lot of these actions. And it wasn't really until fairly recently, within the past 100 years, that Ireland has actually tried to, fully maintain its own sovereignty, its own independence, its own identity. And even now, it's kind of sad because you look at Irish culture and it suffered under 800 years of English rule. I mean, look at the Irish language is probably the most pronounced one. The old Gaelic language of the Celts. Ireland is one of the 6 remaining Celtic nations. And unfortunately, that Irish Gaelic language is classified as an endangered language. There's actually not a whole lot of people in Ireland that can speak that right off the bat in a native tone. Why? Because for 800 years, Britain discouraged the use of Irish language. You had to speak English. You had to speak the King's English. Speak the King's language, man. Well, guess what? I don't speak the King's language, and I will never speak the King's language because even Americans, we speak English. We don't speak English. We speak American English. We speak a much more rough form of it. The Irish have had their own accent added to it, but nonetheless, they suffered. And what I want to do for these next, at least next couple videos, I know of two more that are going to be around this topic, possibly a fourth if I can find enough info to really back it up, is delve a little bit into Irish history, particularly how they kind of gain independence from Britain, but also the hardships that they're suffering under British rule. Now, of course, this is going to culminate in about 1919 with the Irish War for Independence breaking out, and that is probably going to be our second video here, but I also found, of course, in my studies of Irish history, there is an even earlier attempt by the Irish to break away from Britain that ended in an abstract failure, flat off, but it was much earlier, 1798 actually. So that would put it right in the time period of the Napoleonic Wars and right after the American Revolution here at home has concluded. And it's actually where these Irish actually got their ideas at the time for this rebellion was they were inspired by the events that they had seen unfold in the United States and by the events that they were watching unfold occur just across the channel in France, even though it was quite bloody and extreme, and we got a whole nother video on the French Revolution too, but that's coming yet. So what I want to do today is cover the Irish Rebellion of 1798, which is Ireland's first modern attempt, I should say, in the modern era to really break away from English rule, but it also is kind of a remembrance starter for what's going to come in the 20th century because for years after this happened, the Irish were kind of afraid to do armed resistance at times because they feared the response that Britain would have if they tried it again. And it also urged some Irish reformers to try to urge a more peaceful solution, such as the Home Rule option that ultimately is going to become a factor later on. So what we're going to cover is the Irish Rebellion of 1798, which is Ireland's first true attempt of the modern era to gain that independence. And it all has its roots in the Anglo-Irish relations that have come about over the centuries. And this has been since the Middle Ages. If you go to Ireland, you can ask about any person if they have any kind of a negative view on a single country. And it seems like a lot of times, I'm not saying it's everybody, but a lot of the Irish people that you will ask if there's a country, that perhaps they don't have the fondest opinion of, it's England more than any other. Now, of course, it's not on the level today of, let's go to war with them. No, it's just a general dislike. But back in the day, yeah, it would have been war. English-Irish relations, they've not been on a good footing, and it's been mostly at the English expense. The English, we all know what the English do, and I'm not bastardizing the English because I myself have quite a bit of English heritage too. I'm English, I'm Irish, I'm Dutch, I'm German. I have all of that. But we have the issue of the English were really the ones that soured the Irish relations, and it all comes down to that nasty little poking point of religion. That nasty little point that has caused numerous conflicts and wars and fights throughout history, as we've seen, no matter what religion it is or where it is. And it still is now. But, as we all know, in the 1500s, England becomes a Protestant nation. Now, it has kind of dominated Ireland off and on since the Middle Ages, but back then, there wasn't so much the religious quarrel because they both adhered to the Catholic Church. They were both Catholic Christian nations because there was no Protestant Reformation yet. After the 1500s comes about and King Henry VIII gets mad because the Catholic Church isn't going to let him divorce his wife, and he forms his own church, the Anglican Church, and becomes Protestant, England becomes Protestant, Ireland is expected to somewhat follow suit, but that doesn't happen because the Irish are still loyal Catholics. Now, they've been oppressed by the English since roughly the year 1200. And the English, mostly, this has been through exerting dominance and control over the island of Ireland. It's not that they're absolutely murdering people, but they have control of the political institutions. They have control over rule of the island. Ireland is still supposedly its own separate kingdom, but it's a kingdom in name only. It's implied that there's a kingdom of Ireland and there's a kingdom of England and Scotland, or Great Britain, if you want to call it Great Britain. And it's implied that since they're both referred to as two different kingdoms, they're equal. That is not the case. That is not at all what the case is. In fact, starting in the mid 16th century, the English governments that would start coming about after the Protestant Reformation comes about, they are working to diminish the power of Irish Catholics. And they come up, multiple of these successive English governments come up with the idea of how to do that. And they come up with what they call the colonization slash plantation system, where the English run government in Ireland, local government, would confiscate local land from the natives who were Catholic. So if you're Irish Catholic, you could just have your land up and taken from you by the British government simply because of your religion beliefs. Simply because of your religious belief, your land's gone. You have no right to it. Get out of here. And they would take that confiscated land and then hand it to Protestant settlers who England was urging to settle in Ireland from both themselves, from Scotland, from Wales, and they're urging you, oh, come across to Ireland and go settle there, and you can have all this free land. They failed to mention, in most cases, that that land had been taken from Catholics. Or if they did, people just didn't care. But this starts a process of English colonization of Ireland, in which they, in their sick, twisted minds, simply because of religious beliefs, tried to deny the native Irish ownership of their own land by taking it away from them and giving it away to Protestant, like minded settlers from England, Scotland, and Wales, who are going to be more trustworthy to the English government. Because, mind you, they've had conflicts with Catholic nations before. Spain had tried to invade, for instance, England back in the 1550s, I believe it was, 1550s or 1560s. It was somewhere in the latter half of the 16th century with the Spanish Armada, and Spain had tried to invade England simply to make it Catholic again. Now, that ultimately failed, but, there's still wars going on over between Protestant and Catholic nations, and there's this fear among the English government that, these Catholics in Ireland can't be trusted, so let's deprive them as much as we can of rights and privileges and all kinds of other things. So this is going to cause massive plantations to be set up by these Protestant settlers, with one of the largest being up in Ulster, in the province of Ulster, which came from land that was confiscated by multiple Irish nobles who had actually got permanently exiled, and then they took that land and gave it to some Protestant settlers who turned it into an extremely large plantation to operate and farm and own and have people settle on it. Now, the Catholics would continue to resist these measures. I mean, they're not just taking it blindly. They're not just letting you take their land and say absolutely nothing. I mean, they are putting up some kind of resistance, be it through the arguments or be it sometimes they actually would take up arms to try to defend what they saw as their property. It just didn't amount to anything at the time. There wasn't organized resistance. It was just here and there. Now, things are going to turn worse for the Catholics in Ireland come the end of the 17th century. So now we're looking at the end of the 1600s. Now, if you know anything about English history, you know that the end of the 17th century is a critical time for Great Britain because there is the whole issue of the Glorious Revolution, as they call it, of 1688. Now, what happened was in 1685, King Charles II of England had died. And he was a playboy king. I mean, he had over, I think one time I looked and it was over 15 women he was involved with. And he did have children. He had multiple children, in fact. The problem was none of these children, because of the manner of which he'd had them, he was never married to the women in most cases. Because of the manner in which he'd had the children, they were not eligible to inherit the crown. So, although Charles II had all of these children, none of them were a legitimate heir. What occurs in 1685 upon his death is his younger brother, James, the Duke of York, I believe is what it was. He ends up becoming king as King James II. Now, the problem with James is a Catholic. He's now in charge of a Protestant nation. Now, he's not going to pull the whole spin like Bloody Mary back in 1553 to 1558. She actually forcibly tried to reconvert England to Catholicism by burning people at the stake. He's not going to go that route. But the people in England do not trust a Catholic king in charge of a Protestant nation. Because, mind you, the King of England is also the head of the Protestant English Church, the Anglican Church. So how can you have a Catholic that is subservient to what they view? Well, they view he's subservient. They view that he is subservient to the Pope, but now he's also going to be the head of our Protestant church. The people were not going to sit for it, and resentment kind of builds over 3 years until 1688, when just before Christmas in that year, I think it was December 23rd, James is actually forced to abdicate his throne because of the people absolutely not having a like for him. They start an uprising against him, and in an effort to try to prevent a civil war from breaking out, James resigns his throne. He abdicates. The following February, in February of 1689, Parliament invites James's Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, which was also, I believe, James's nephew, William of the Netherlands, William of Orange. They invite them to take the crown as dual monarchs, as constitutional monarchs, as King William III and Queen Mary II. This absolutely aggravates James. James had abdicated, yes, but he felt that he would abdicate and that his son would become king. That is not what happened. So now James is very, very argumentative. He's very ticked off, to put it bluntly, and he actually starts a civil war in England. He tries to regain his throne because this is not the outcome that he had envisioned was going to happen. And there is a war that goes on in England between Catholics, which are led by the former King James II, who's also being backed by the Kingdom of France, who was also Catholic and the traditional enemy of England. And then you got the Kingdom of England that is being led by King William III and Queen Mary II. Now, how does this affect the Irish? Well, the Irish are mostly Catholic. The native Irish are, at least. And who do you think they side with in this conflict? They're going to side with the king that's Catholic. So they side with James II. Now, had James come out on top, that probably would have worked out well for them. Unfortunately, that is not what happens, because in 1691, James is defeated at the Battle of Boyne by King William III in Ireland. This puts an end to his little attempt to regain his throne immediately, and James ends up going to exile in France. So the rebellion's done. It's over with. But because the Irish had aided James, this only furthers Protestant distrust of them even more. The Protestants in Ireland, the Protestants back in the British Isles, they distrust the Irish Catholics even further, and now it's punishment time. You helped try to overthrow this government, now you're going to pay for it. So what are they going to do? We're going to put punishments on you. So what England does is they give Ireland its own parliament. In fact, it's had its own parliament. Ireland has had its own parliament since roughly the Middle Ages, at this time, at least. I mean, it doesn't. I think it has its own now, but we're talking in terms of British rule. But the Ireland had its own parliament separate from the British Parliament, and this parliament was located in Dublin, which is now the capital of Ireland, and it kind of has always historically been the center of government in Ireland. But they have their own parliament in Dublin, but it's kind of a show parliament. It's a shadow parliament. It doesn't hold much authority because the real executive power in Ireland actually lies with somebody called the Lord Lieutenant, who is appointed by the British Parliament. And to complicate matters more, the Irish Parliament, yes, can pass laws. It can pass acts on its own, but those laws and acts have to get the consent and agreement of both the British Parliament and the King. The King actually, or Queen, if it's a Queen, but most of the time it was a King back then. They actually have to get the consent of the King and the British Parliament, and any act that they pass could be overridden by any of those two. Even though they did not live in Ireland, never were there half the time, they could still override it and say what's best for the Irish people, even though they weren't even there. So it's a show parliament. The punishments that come down from the failed attempt to restore James II to the throne in the late 17th century comes to that Protestants end up being denied a lot of civil rights in Ireland. For example, you cannot vote if you're Catholic. You have no right to vote in Ireland. You cannot hold political office in Ireland if you are a Catholic. You cannot join the army in Ireland if you are a Catholic. And you cannot purchase or inherit land. Yeah, ridiculous. You're Catholic, so no voting, no government job for you, no army job for you, and you cannot own or inherit your any land. So go about. So this is going to cause resentment to build up among the Irish population, in particular, even Irish peasants who are constantly being exploited by their Protestant landlords because, mind you, they can't buy and own their own land anymore. They're entirely at the mercy of these Protestant landlords. And they are not the only people being affected by this. You have non Anglican Protestant groups such as Presbyterians, who originally came from Scotland. They are also included in these bands of civil rights, just as much as the Irish Catholics are, because they're not Anglican Protestants. So that's also going to cause resentment there as well. So this is going to lead to a growing call in Ireland for political change. They want a change to how the system is run. And it's going to come through about the next century. I mean, we have 1689, and this rebellion is going to break out in 1798. So the reformers are going to really put an emphasis on they want equality of rights and a greater independence from Great Britain. They don't want to be so reliant upon them, and they want a greater equality for everybody, despite their religious denomination. And this is kind of the main fighting line and the main talk point up until the late 18th century. Then we have two massive world events that occur, and we kind of mentioned them earlier. 1775, the 13 British colonies in North America, they start their own war for independence. The American Revolution breaks out in 1775. By 1783, that war is over, and Britain has actually lost those colonies because they have fully asserted their independence as the new United States of America, which I am living in now. That's the first one. And a revolution based not on establishing a dictatorship like government, not on installing a monarch like government, but establishing a government based on a kind of a new concept at the time, but not really a new concept, of democratic liberty, equality, and the people having the right to choose everything. This is going to inspire, in 1789, a revolution to break out in America's wartime ally, the Kingdom of France, who sees its monarch overthrown and executed. And it gets a lot more bloody than the American Revolution ever did, but this breaks out the French Revolution in 1789. And both of these are professed to be around the ideas of liberty and equality and democracy and everything else. This inspires the Irish reformers because they're seeing these two revolutions. Mind you, the first one was a complete success almost. The second one was a mixed bag. It didn't quite work out in the end. Initially, the French Revolution was working out, but by the end of it, I mean, you have Napoleon come along and he establishes a dictatorship, so it really just went right back to where it started by the time he got done with it by the 1790s. But what happens here is this inspires the Irish political reformers because now they're seeing acts unfold on the world stage that are in line with the view of Ireland that they somewhat want to live in. And they're saying, well, if this can happen and be accomplished in America, and if this can happen and be accomplished in France, why on earth can we not do it here? And it starts to inspire them with a new set of ideals for a new independent Ireland. And this is going to bring into play the big player in this Irish Revolution that's going to break out in 1798, and that is the United Irishmen group. And this was a group that was founded in October of 1791 in Dublin by several revolutionaries and their associates. And among these most prominent ones was a man named Theobald Wolfetone. And he's going to end up being a very major player in this Irish rebellion. He was very much an Irish revolutionary. He didn't believe in British rule over Ireland, and he kind of becomes a martyr for its cause by the time it's all said and done. Now, the United Irishmen are going to have branches established in Dublin, and they're also going to have one in Belfast. Belfast, I'm trying to say how I've heard it 5 dozen times, sometimes with an Irish accent, sometimes not. But you have it in Dublin, and you also have it in Belfast. And they're going to want the United Irishmen at first are not a violent organization. They are not violent in any form. They want a peaceful reform towards a more democratic and independent Ireland. They don't want violence to be the main instigator of political change because they know that won't look well. And they know that's not going to end well either for either side. Now, the majority of leadership in this organization, in the United Irishmen, was Protestant, But the key word here is that the United Irishmen are actually open to all denominations. Although most of their leadership is Protestant, you can be Catholic, you can be Presbyterian, you can be an atheist. They don't care. You can be a Anglican if you really want to. If you really are a English Protestant and you actually want to join them, join them. They are open to all. They hope to get rid of this whole sectarian divide among the Irish in Ireland, where religion was this dividing line between the different parties. They wanted to make that go away and said, here's an organization that we don't care what religious denomination you are or what your beliefs are. We are open to everybody that has the same cause and the same will to have a more democratic and united independent Ireland. And this comes about in 1791. Now, at first, the United Irishmen aren't any sort of a problem to Britain. They don't view, I mean, they're peaceful, they don't cause any kind of trouble, and Britain's not really viewing them as a threat. This is going to change in 1793. Because 1793, Britain goes to war with revolutionary France because the French Revolution's going on. It's gotten, at this point, the king and his wife have been executed, and the French Revolution is starting to enter its more radical phase, where anyone associated with the former French monarchy is being persecuted and executed in any which manner or form. And this scares the crap out of the British. The British are literally shaking in their boots because and they're not the only ones. I mean, almost every single European monarchy in Europe was actually quite scared of what the French Revolution was turning into. It wasn't just Britain. You had Prussia was scared of it, Austria, Russia. You had all the Holy Roman Empire. You had all of these monarchies in Europe that are terrified of what is going on because they fear that the French Revolution is turning so bloody and radical. They fear it's spreading. They fear that antagonistic response by the crowd to the downfall of the monarchy could come into their countries and see their monarchies overthrown. And you know good and well the British are not going to get rid of their king. Oh no, they're not going to do that, even if their king, like the one right now, is literally one of the sorriest ones I've ever seen compared to his mother. His mother was at least a decent ruler, but that's modern day. But we go into the whole topic where Britain is scared to death of how violent the French Revolution is becoming. So, in an effort to try to contain it before it can spread, let's go to war. We'll put down this revolutionary government, we'll reinstall a monarchy, and all will be said and done. Easy. They never think this stuff through, do they? You really think a people that just overthrew our monarchy are going to welcome you installing a puppet one? No. But do you think anyone thought of that? No. But this is going to set the change that's going to come about in the United Irishmen because the United Irishmen, they're very sympathetic to the French revolutionaries because they like the success that they're having. They have the vision of equality and liberty and democracy that the United Irishmen want for Ireland. And this causes England to kind of start paying attention a little more to them because now that we're at war with France and we got a party in our territory that is friendly with them, they might be a threat. So now Britain's kind of eyeing the United Irishmen a little bit and saying, yeah, I'm just going to watch you from a distance because I'm engaged down here, but you are a worry in my mind. You are a problem. So don't make any wrong moves. So that's pretty much what they're doing at this time. And in 1794, just a year later, it was actually revealed that many of the United Irishmen leadership were colluding with the French Revolutionary government. And this caused Britain to finally take action against the United Irishmen. They ended up banning the organization in Ireland. It was absolutely banned. And they started arresting members of the leadership that they could find. Now, Theobald Wolfetone, they fail to find him because he actually escapes and goes into exile here in the United States and America. Now, he's going to return one day, but he does escape this initial persecution. Due to the party, well, not the party, but the organization being banned, they're forced to go underground and kind of operate in the almost like your criminal organizations almost, but they're not a criminal organization, but they're having to operate under the radar to avoid detection by the local authorities. Now, this shortly is followed by Britain is also scared of France taking advantage of this chaos that's starting to kind of broil in Ireland and the Irish English-run government, the Irish Parliament one, they go ahead and, in order to try to establish some strength for a defense against a French invasion or against any enemies that may be within Ireland, like the United Irishmen, they recreate what they call the local militia, the militia forces. And this ends up being a quite dangerous move by the Irish slash English run government because it's compulsory military service. I mean, if you're called to serve in the militia, you have to serve in the militia. You have no choice. And that is not very popular with the people of Ireland. They are not very fond of a compulsory military service. And that was also the case about 100 years later when the Irish War for Independence is going to break out, because one of the grievances just before that broke out was World War I's going on, and Britain is trying to replenish its ranks, and the Irish have, up until 1918, been largely kept out of compulsory military service. Now, they've had volunteers, but they've not been included in the drafts because they know that the Irish are not that fond of getting involved in a war. 1918, the Germans launched a spring offensive, and Britain says, "No, what? No, they're British subjects. We're drafting them. I don't care what their personal opinion is." And that backfires spectacularly. But that's 100 years later. But the same attitude is there. And in 1798, this was no different. The Irish are not wanting any sort of compulsory military service, and it's very unpopular at home. And then it's also dangerous because, as part of that compulsory military service, the government is also arming Catholics. Now, mind you, Catholics aren't supposed to be in the army, but this isn't classified as the army. This is classified as the militia. It's not a full, regular trained army. So they're giving Catholics guns now, which to the English run Irish government is kind of suspicious of. They're like, yeah, I'm going to give you a gun, but I don't fully trust you, so just watch your back. It's dangerous. You're kind of giving them the tools to say, you know what, if I have the decision that I want to get rid of you, you just gave me a weapon. And this comes at a real bad time because this is the same time that the United Irishmen are becoming radical in their approach to a possible independent democratic Ireland. They become radicalized during their years underground. Between 1791 and 1798, they undergo a radical transformation in their goals and objectives. And mostly, the change that comes is beforehand, they simply wanted a more democratic, independent Ireland with more equality. They didn't want to break away from England entirely. They were still willing to be part of, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, whatever you want to call. This is going to change now because of the response that they received when Britain went to war with France. They are now come to the point that they're changing that belief to they want a Ireland completely severed of all ties with Britain, and they want to establish an Irish republic, like has been done in the United States, and like the French revolutionaries are trying to establish in France. So they want an Irish republic, entirely independent, full of its own sovereignty, full equality for everybody, and completely cut off from Britain. No ties to it whatsoever. We're done with Britain at this point. And the bad side of this, they're willing at this point now, beforehand they were peaceful. Now they're willing to embrace violence in order to achieve those goals. So the whole British policy of cracking down on the United Irishmen actually makes the situation worse. It radicalizes them to the point that now they don't want nothing to do with Britain at this point, and they're willing to use violence to achieve their goals, making them much more into almost, in some ways, and this would be a really extreme way of putting it, but in some ways, I suppose for the time, they could be been classified as almost a terrorist organization because they were willing to use violence in an open-ended manner just to achieve a point. Now, that's a real far comparison, but the similarity is there, is what I'm getting at. And that's what the British at least would have kind of viewed them as. Now, in order to build a military capability, because mind you, the United Irishmen are not a military organization yet. They don't have any kind of professional armed training or anything else, and they don't even have the numbers to really go at a rebellion on their own. They need help. And they do this in two ways. The first way is they ally themselves with another anti British group that is in Ireland that is mostly made up of Irish Catholics, and these are called the Irish Defenders. And they are Catholics who are fighting against Protestants. Now, the defenders have already engaged in violent action against Protestant landowners that have taken advantage of Catholic peasants and common Catholic artisans and merchants and anyone else in Ireland who had been offended by the Protestant elite. So the defenders already have a violent record on them. But that also means that the defenders are a little more experienced with, engaging in acts of violence, and it's going to bolster the United Irishmen's numbers so that when they do decide to launch a rebellion, they're going to actually have some men to actually back it up. So this is going to also broaden their national reach because now that we're allied with a Catholic organization, even though, the United Irishmen are supposedly open, but their leadership at least, is Protestant. Now we're allied with Catholics, so we're trying to convey that image on a national scale that we are all united despite our denominations, that anyone is welcome, and that this is a common cause. It's going to work to a certain degree. The second goal that the United Irishmen are going to try to do is they realize that their possible best ally to try to overthrow English rule is literally right across the channel right now. The same country that England is at war with, France. So they want to secure an alliance with France. They hoped that by securing such an alliance that France would supply military support for an uprising, and this does actually succeed. Wolfe Tone actually comes back from the United States in the 1790s, and he successfully negotiates with the French to actually send an expedition in December of 1796 that to try to land troops in Ireland in order to kick off a rebellion, and it was about 14,000 troops. That is a decent number of troops for France to send, despite considering the fact that they're engaged in a war with Britain and the Holy Roman Empire and multiple other countries on their own borders, and they still sent 14,000 troops to try to help Ireland out and start home there, which I guess would have played to their advantage, because if you can get a rebellion started and going on in Ireland, Britain would hopefully have to divert troops and resources away from the battlefields in France to trying to take care of this rebellion going on at home. And that's what they're hoping is going to occur. Now, the French, unfortunately for the Irish, they get turned back. They do not encounter the Royal Navy. They actually elude the Royal Navy, which is quite surprising given how dominant the Royal Navy was on the high seas. What turns them back is the winter storms. The winter storms get so bad that when they get near the southwest coast of Ireland, the French expedition actually loses a couple of ships, and it gets so bad to the point that the French commanders decide, okay, we are not progressing. We can't get where I'm not going to risk this whole expedition because we already have, we only have 14,000 men, which is a good size, but, we can't just afford to lose everybody and pin our hopes on a massive uprising. So they turn back to France. That French expedition in 1796 does not make it to Ireland. So the rebellion does not kick off yet. But it does manage to make things worse because the English run government is more than aware of the form of the French expedition having tried to land in Ireland. They're more than aware of who tried to organize it, and this is going to cause them to go through a counterinsurgency campaign against the United Irishmen, because at this point they're full-blown traitors, they're full-blown charged with treason, and are to be executed pretty much at this point. So the Irish Parliament, its government, and the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the English-run Irish stooges, they resort to torture, summary executions, mass arrests, and house burnings to try to intimidate the population, to get them to back off from supporting the United Irishmen, and to try to crack down on the United Irishmen. The army and militia get supported by a newly raised yeomanry, which the yeomanry is comprised of mostly Protestant loyalists who are going to further those sectarian divides in Ireland to try to get the population war against each other. Now, they are going to have an ultimate success with this because the government ends up getting spies to infiltrate and kind of penetrate and subvert the United Irishmen from within, which causes most of the leadership to actually get arrested of the United Irishmen, and then those leaders are also executed shortly after. And one of them, perhaps, was the prominent military figurehead, Edward Fitzgerald, who he got killed while resisting arrest on May 18th of 1798, just about a month before this rebellion is going to break out. Now, you might ask, why are we going over why the leadership was killed? Because this is going to play a major part in the rebellion as to why it failed. When the rebellion breaks out in June, well, not even June, it was late May, so this is just days before. When the rebellion breaks out, the United Irishmen have just been purged of a lot of their prominent leaders, both leaders that were politically, skilled in the political field and leaders who were skilled in the military field. And so when this rebellion breaks out, it's kind of a last ditch effort to, do a rebellion before it's too late, before we don't have the strength and numbers and anything to do it. The bad part of it comes that since your leadership's just been purged, it's disorganized as all get out. They don't have coordination. They don't have, a top figure giving orders down from above that are clear and precise. It's kind of everybody for themselves just saying, oh, yeah, we're working together, but we really don't know what anyone else is doing right now. Which that's going to cripple this rebellion from the start. There's not very good coordination across the board, and the reason why, most of the leadership just got arrested and executed, literally a month or so before this occurred. So on May 23rd, the United Irishmen come to the decision it's now or never. I mean, the English are cracking down on us. We're not going to have, this opportunity if we wait. So on the night of May 23rd, they decide we're launching this rebellion. May 23rd, 1798, they signal the start of this by halting the mail coaches that are leaving Dublin. They end up stopping them and actually preventing them from leaving the town. Now, despite the rebellion starting, it's not exactly a flare up across Ireland. In fact, there's one main area where most of the casualties and atrocities come from, and that is the county of Wexford. And that is right around kind of where Dublin is, at least not far from Dublin, I believe. But Dublin ends up being placed under a military lockdown very early on as this rebellion starts out, and it's actually never seriously threatened by the rebels. The Irish rebels, from the get go, fail to secure or even try to even do some damage to perhaps the most prolific target, the very seat of English governmental power in Ireland. And they lose that opportunity almost from the get go. So that is going to shift the conflict to an area in the county of Wexford where the rebels are actually gaining some momentum from this start on May 23rd. Excuse me. But county of Wexford sees some momentum gained. The rebels win a victory over the North Cork militia on May 27th, so 4 days into this rebellion, and they end up capturing, after this victory, the towns of Enniscorthy and Wexford. And this is a success. They do capture 2 towns. That's pretty good. The problem is they fail to really capitalize on that success, and their further attempts to break out of those 2 towns and go into the towns of New Ross, Arklow, Newton's Barry, they end up being bloodily repulsed by the British forces that end up trying to surround them. So they can't break out of these 2 towns. They can't even try to get to another one to try to seize it and occupy it. So they're forced to kind of stay where they are. And this frustrates the rebels in Wexford to a very high degree. And they end up kind of very darkly committing atrocities in response. When one of these was at a barn at Scullabogue, they ended up burning over 100 loyalists in a barn just because they were mad that they couldn't get out. So now they're trying to commit atrocities to try to intimidate and perhaps maybe frighten the English off, and it's not working. So they're demoralized at this point, and the rebels fall back. They retreat out of the 2 towns, and they fall back to their main camp at Vinegar Hill, which is a big mount that overlooks the 2. It's actually, I think, near Enniscorthy in particular. It's across a river. But they try to regroup at their main camp on Vinegar Hill. And now Vinegar Hill is going to become much greater here very shortly. Then, after this retreat from Enniscorthy, the fighting very briefly moves up to the province in the north of Ulster. And this is going to happen in early June when the United Irishman companies in the counties of Antrim and Down are going to rise up to try to support what's going on in the south. So they want to try to split the British forces a little bit. So let's get some men up here and actually try to do some crap. This is commanded by the commanders of the United Irishmen of Henry Joy McCracken and Henry Monroe. Unfortunately, they meet a similar fate to what happened at Enniscorthy, where they do not have the men or the resources to capitalize on any sort of major success, and that's going to cause them to lack sufficient military strength to even make a headway into the rest of Ulster. And by the middle of June, just like a week or two in, this action up in Ulster actually ends up being put down and is defeated by British forces. And McCracken and Monroe, in actually particular, they end up being captured and they're executed, which means that the United Irish forces in Ulster now are without any kind of military leadership. They're just kind of there and they end up being soundly defeated, which leads to the crucial victory at Vinegar Hill. Vinegar Hill was the main encampment of the United Irishmen rebels and their associates, and it was just outside of Enniscorthy. And the authorities, the British authorities, they had already started to turn their attention toward this hill because they realized if you get that, that's like the nerve center of this whole uprising. We can put an end to this rather pretty quickly. So on June 21st of 1798, about 1 month in to the rebellion, the British forces there under General Gerard Lake, they ended up surrounding the site, and before Lake decides to storm it with his men, he unleashes a massive artillery bombardment for a couple hours on this hill, which doesn't have any trees on it that much at the time. It's mostly kind of an oversight hill, so it's pretty barren up there, except minus maybe whatever the United Irish rebels have set up. And he bombards this thing for hours on end before finally sending in his regular army troops to actually storm it and take the rebel camp. The rebels suffer heavy losses at the Battle of Vinegar Hill, and they are soundly defeated at this. This is actually really the critical victory that puts an end to the rebellion. It's a very short-lived rebellion, because the United Irishmen just really, they waited too long, I think, in my opinion. They didn't do it when they had the opportunity. They should have launched it much earlier to try to, capitalize on their numbers and everything else. But the time they launched it, they just didn't have the leadership. They were already crippled by the British crackdowns. It just wasn't a good launch time for them. So some of the rebels will end up escaping from Vinegar Hill, but they're going to largely be done at this point. I mean, they're going to go to the surrounding hills, but the rebellion's largely over. The only further flare-up is going to come a little bit too late, and that's going to be in August of 1798, which is really the last action. And this actually comes on part of the French. Now, the French had apparently been deliberating as soon as they got word that the rebellion had broken out, do we send another expedition to try to back them up? And they deliberated so long that by the time that they decided to send an expedition, I mean, the rebellion had already largely been defeated. But they sent this expedition anyway to Ireland under the command of the French general Jean Humbert, who he succeeds in landing a second French force on the western coast of Ireland. So this is far away from where the fighting's been happening, more on the east coast. Now he's going to the west coast in the county of Mayo. In Killala Bay is where he actually ends up landing this force. And it's unlike the one that had been sent a couple years earlier in 1796. The one in 1796 had about 14,000 French soldiers. This force is only 1,100. 1,100 soldiers, that's all France sent. That is not going to accomplish much. So Humbert is really heavily relying on the hope that the arrival of the French troops will inspire the local people to rise en masse against the British and assist them. They're hoping that they haven't come too late. Unfortunately, they have, because on August 27th, Humbert does win a victory at the Battle of Castlebar, but it fails to inspire any sort of large mass revolt among the local Irish. And due to this, Humbert kind of comes to the realization, I've lost there's no chance for me here because, yes, I've won this small victory, but the British are going to be sending all kinds of reinforcements at this point. I don't have the men to counteract them. So he ends up surrendering to the British at Ballinamuck on September 8th of that year, which brings an official end to the Irish Rebellion, which is very short-lived. It's about a good solid month. I mean, if you really want to include, that jump to August, you're talking three months, solid good 3 months, going into maybe 4. But yeah, it fails almost from the outright. It's actually kind of sad with the Irish Rebellion because it is Ireland's first attempt to really gain any sort of a independent streak, but it's also the one that fails the worst. It's just utterly devastated and crushed the United Irishmen in particular. I mean, they don't even come out of this alive. By 1800, they had disbanded. And Wolfe Tone had actually been with this second Irish, well, not Irish, but French expedition. He'd actually been with them. Now, he ended up leaving with them, but about a month later in October of 1798, he ends up being captured by the British at sea, and he's condemned to death by hanging. But before that the British can get the satisfaction of killing him by hanging him, he actually slits his own throat while he is being held in British custody and dies in prison. And he actually has a grave in Ireland today. It's kind of like a public memorial to him, that it's kind of open, the ground is open where he is, but the rest kind of encased in concrete. It's kind of cool looking. But he's still highly revered as an Irish revolutionary, and to the factor that he was kind of defiant to the end because he said, "Oh, you think you're going to kill me? No, I'm going to kill myself because I'm not giving you that satisfaction." This right here would be Wolfe Tone, who would kind of organize a lot of the French actions during the war, but also kind of been a driver for the United Irishmen. And he was rather young. I believe he was only born in 1760. So if I'm not wrong, for what I remember, he was only in his 30s when this happened. This is the symbol of the United Irishmen, the symbol that they took on. And very pronouncedly, right there at the top, you can kind of see they have the word equality, which is kind of what they were striving for in a large sense. In many ways, that's what they wanted. That's what they professed within their organization, is that, we don't care what your denomination is. We think that everyone should be equal. This right here is just kind of a painting of the inside of the Irish Parliament, which is kind of the seat of English power in Ireland. And that's actually going to come to an end here very soon, which we're going to talk about here very shortly. But it was very much almost like the English Parliament, but on a much smaller scale. And it was for local government, but could be easily overridden by English Parliament and by the king. So it was kind of a show parliament. Here we have the Battle of Vinegar Hill, which was much more of a massacre than it really was a battle, but in this painting, at least, they depicted it as a battle. But in reality, I mean, the British absolutely bombarded that hill first, then sent their forces to storm the hill. Both infantry and cavalry, as we can see here, were just sent to absolutely rush in and demolish any kind of resistance that the rebels had at that point. And then this one, what I kind of found interesting was this is a marker that was set in 1998 at, I believe, Vinegar Hill. It's for a Liberty tree. It could be wrong on the location, but it's for a Liberty tree that's planted in memoriam of the 200th anniversary of the uprising. And what it says on this stone is kind of reminiscent of, how the Irish were fighting for liberty and democracy and equality, and they gotten these ideas from the French and American revolutions, because it reads, "What is that in your hand? It is a branch. Of what? Of the tree of liberty. Where did it first grow? In America. Where does it bloom? In France. Where did the seeds fall? In Ireland." So what is the aftermath of this rebellion that comes about? It's not even really a revolution. Well, it's going to be a total disaster. The United Irishmen are actually vanquished, and they end up dissolving within 2 years of this rebellion breaking out. And it ends up to just reprisals by the British on local civilians. who they kind of view as having supported the United Irishmen, so they should share in the havoc and chaos and punishment that the United Irishmen would have gotten. The death toll is estimated to be actually within the tens of thousands, which I'm actually going to take a minute here and see if I can locate what the estimated death toll was. Because I actually do not know off the top of my head what the estimate is. I'm going to see if I can actually find what the estimated death toll here for this rebellion was. All right, so for the estimated, roughly, we're looking at between 10 to 52,000 deaths is what we're actually kind of looking at. For a death toll for this Irish rebellion of 1798, you're looking at a death toll anywhere between 10 to 52,000. That's pretty big. I mean, that's actually, I think, more than what the Irish War for Independence. I mean, it was relatively very bloody compared to this, but even the death toll, I don't think, was that high. The Civil War is what made it high, which would be also one of our further videos, because Ireland kind of gains independence, but at the same time, I mean, they have a civil war break out at home because of disagreements over that peace treaty, and that ends up being far bloodier than the War for Independence had been. But yeah, 10 to 52,000 from this Irish rebellion, which is actually quite substantial. Now, what is going to happen? It's going to deepen the sectarian ties, because remember, Catholics and Protestants came to blows during this rebellion, and it's just going to make them distrust each other even more. It's going to be harder for those factions to work together in the future, which works to Britain's advantage. And Britain, in response to this, is going to get a lot stricter on Ireland. They actually try to get closer control of it. First, in 1801, they abolished the Irish Parliament. Ireland has no parliament anymore of its own. It is now has about 100 representatives in the British Westminster Parliament. So Ireland still has representatives, but again, the old rules apply. No Catholics can hold political office. So the penal laws are reinstated that kind of keep the Catholics out of stuff. And Ireland's parliament is officially abolished. It is now merged with Britain's parliament, and then the Kingdom of Ireland is now merged with the Kingdom of Great Britain into the United Kingdom in 1801. So now there's no further two separate kingdoms, and it kind of diminishes Ireland's somewhat independence within English control, because now it's in the same kingdom as England is, and you know who's going to hold most of the power there. So it leads to what the Irish Rebellion of 1798 does is it leads to the situation that Ireland is going to find itself in throughout the 19th century and up to 1921, when it gains semi-independence from Britain with the War of Independence. This is going to set the stage for modern Irish republicanism to take place, because there's this thought that, yes, we want an independent Ireland. But at the same time, we kind of realize trying to break away from England is just going to lead to a bloody war, because we've seen how the English reacted with the Irish Rebellion of 1798. So do we really want to try? We know what the British are going to do and respond with if we try to actually break away. So they come to the conclusion, all right, now we need to go through peaceful means, or we need to look for a more viable option, because maybe full independence is not going to be on the roster here. And that's going to come up with that home rule idea that some Irish had, where Ireland would kind of be able to exercise some rights within its own, but still be ultimately loyal to the British crown and parliament. But that's going to come about throughout the 19th century. So this really is going to set the stage for a lot of the events that are to come. But it's Ireland's first attempt to try to strike out on its own, and it just is a whopping defeat and a failure that kind of sets the Irish back well over a century. It's kind of sad. And it just shows, just even back then, I mean, Ireland is suffering at British hands. Britain, instead of trying to reconcile the problems that had caused the rebellion after the war, they didn't even try that. Let's not try reconciliation, try to actually solve what the heck happened that caused these people to hate us so much. Let's just crack down further and cause further problems. Pretty sad. But that pretty much covers it for today's topic. First video of 2023, and 2023 is well over 3/4 done. But we do have a couple more that I do hope and plan on doing here very soon. In fact, I'm probably going to be moving on them here within a week. So, given that nothing happens, we will be on here just a little bit more regularly for the time being, but we'll just see, how everything turns out. But that is at least the plan for right now. Again, I've said things before and things pop up, so I'm not giving any guarantees. But yeah, that does complete it for today's video. So hopefully everyone that might never have heard of this, you might have gained a little bit of a view of what it was, and I encourage you to go out there and look it up on your own and learn more about it. I'm really into Irish history right now, and I'm also really into Irish music in particular. I've gotten to the point that I've even gotten a Irish tin whistle, and I'm trying to learn myself just to see if I can actually play some of these Irish songs on an actual Irish instrument, because I have a banjo, but a banjo, at least the one I have, not an Irish instrument. This is. So, and these cost like $15 or so. They're not much at all for a good, decent one. But that concludes for today. So if you do have any questions, be sure to leave those in the comment section. Any recommendations for topics, even about Irish history I might not know, or even about any kind of history topic that you think needs to be covered, be sure to leave that. And any other questions or comments, just be sure to always leave them. They're always appreciated, even if they are negative, because we got to take criticism every once in a while. We got to see, what did we do wrong? What do we need to be better? And I'm not going to always spot it on my own. So feel free to leave positive or negative. We take all feedback. But I think that will conclude it for this week. So hopefully we'll have that up within a week from now. And hopefully everyone remains well. Hopefully no one is getting sick with the flu or COVID or anything like that. I mean, I thought the one thing was over, but apparently it's not. So this is it for this week. So have a good week, good day, and we'll see you all back here for the next video when it comes out.